Well, hello everybody. We're so grateful that you've spared the time to join us today. We've had about 120 registrants um, from across our planet, and we're really excited today because we've got some really fabulous speakers with amazing set of expertise from different perspectives. Um, and so I will introduce those speakers. They will talk on their various aspects. We'll then have a panel discussion and a Q&A. Please ask your questions via the question button. We're very fortunate to have some consumers sharing very openly today their stories, and they'll be really open to any questions you might like to ask them as well. There will be some conversations that might be emotional or distressing. So please trust yourself, be kind to yourselves, and what you're able to take in today. If you need to step away at any point, please feel free to do so. The recording will be available online afterwards, and if you want to watch it back another time, then you can. So my name is Gareth Bainham. I'm a genetics doctor and I'm the medical director of the Rare Care Centre at Perth Children's Hospital. That's a cross-sector service for children living with rare diseases. So really to help their journeys across their entire life experience, be it in the education sector, the mental health sector, the health sector, the education sector, as they grow up, the employment sector, etc. So I'm really privileged to learn together with those with the children and the families that we serve. We have some truly remarkable presenters today. So we have Anna Pakjoy. She's the founder and chair of Rare Find Foundation. Her connection with the charity is deeply personal. In December 2017, at just 7 months old, her son Sebi was diagnosed with Tay-Sachs disease. Sadly, Sebi passed away in March 2019, aged 22 months. Anna understands firsthand the challenges Tay-Sachs families in Australia face, and so inspired by the spirit and courage of her son that she established the Rare Find Foundation in August 2019, together with her husband, Mark. Rare Find Foundation exists to improve the lives of those living with Tay-Sachs and Sandox diseases through support, information, advocacy, as well as to support research of these conditions. Anna lives with her husband and 3-year-old daughter Layla in Adelaide, and is also the managing director of Career Link People Solutions. So Anna's not busy at all. Heather is the chief executive officer and founder of Syndromes Without a Name. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Heather for a good number of years. Swan provides a remarkable service with information, support, connection and advocacy to families caring for children with an undiagnosed or a rare diagnosed genetic condition. She's the mother of 2 children, one whom has a rare genetic condition called FOXP1 syndrome. Heather is a consumer representative on a number of different advocacy groups and committees, and is passionate about health and disability and advocacy thereof. Again, a real slacker. Stephanie is the Senior Genetic Counsellor in the Genetic Paediatric Service at WA, working clinically both in paediatrics and the Rare Care Centre at the Perth Children's Hospital. She's a certified genetic counsellor, and Stephanie has over 20 years of experience in multiple special areas, working at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, and then in Perth at Genetic Services WA, and then at the Children's Hospital with the Rare Care Centre. She's the founding co-chair of the Genetic Counselling Working Group of the Undiagnosed Diseases Network International, a network that now has about 140 institutions globally connected to help people with undiagnosed diseases. And Stephanie's been a real leading light in that global network. Stephanie has pursued a special interest in working with families living with rare and undiagnosed conditions through broad-scale collaboration and project development. She's also one of my moral compasses, I think. Again, someone that twiddles her thumbs. So over now to Stephanie, who'll be speaking about how clinicians can best support their patients and families as they navigate genetic testing in pursuit of a genetic diagnosis. Over to you, Steph.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation to join today. It's an honour and privilege, and particularly with the other speakers, I'm delighted to be able to share my perspectives as a professional and hear their perspectives as well, and also to join Gareth, a colleague for a very long time and a fellow rare and undiagnosed disease warrior, I suppose. So we'll just move right along and look at, I guess any of us that work in genetics, we always want to talk to others and share with other health professionals the importance of pre-test counselling. So when we're talking about doing genetic counselling in whatever setting that is, we always feel that the time taken to explain and also to engage actively with families is never wasted, and in fact sets the scene for whatever the results might be and for the journey beyond there. And one of the first things that we feel is particularly important is to talk about what the expectations of the testing might be. And that's to look at it from not only the perspective of the health professionals, but the family. What do they think and hope for in terms of this genetic testing, and what might be the changes or the lack of changes to a child's management beyond that test result. And also talking about the actual testing process, what's actually involved. And that's not just the process of a simple blood test. It's also talking about the complexity and the timeframes, because genetic testing is not like just a routine blood test. It takes a long time. What are we actually doing in the background, and explaining that to families? And so also we feel it's essential to look at what the possible implications of genetic test results might be. So talking through, if we find an answer, what path might that take us down? If we don't find an answer, we will call that an inconclusive result. And what happens next? And so, of course, in that, we also have discussions with families about pregnancy planning, and is this something that this test result could have an impact on what plans they may have to have for the children, and what options might be available to them. We also talk about the shared nature of genetic information, and that's how this could impact other family members. And we will start with the immediate family, so the parents themselves, and whether they could perhaps, for instance, be carriers of a condition, and whether there's a potential risk for other children that they have to be affected. And that can be also because conditions can be very variable, and we know that. But it's not just the immediate family. There might be implications for other family members, particularly if they're planning pregnancy. And we also talk about what resources there might be that families can read more about the genetic testing process if they want to. So I wanted to give specific examples of what we can do as healthcare providers, because we can have general conversations about having supportive dialogues, being open and transparent, and being there to answer questions. But I like to think that giving specific examples is actually, it can help us more on a day-to-day basis. And so one of the things that I really feel is an important, in fact, an essential part in this early stages of genetic testing is to introduce our clinic role as facilitating a mutual journey. And I guess this is not just involving genetic testing, this is also the clinical and working relationships with families, that we're learning together with families, particularly with rare, ultra rare and undiagnosed diseases, that it's a shared process, and that we're going to learn about signs and symptoms, we're going to build records, and we're going to work with you, and that we'll also approach you and your family as individuals and as a family unit in terms of problem solving and also making decisions. We'll do that together. And I just wanted to mention the importance of language, and I think Anna's going to pick this up from a different perspective. But I guess we are very much in genetics, we love the use of analogies. And the reason for that is that the complexity of genetic language itself, let alone explaining a testing process, and to simplify that as much as possible, to tailor it to a particular family's cultural, religious or psychoeducational background. And of course, one of the classic examples is that we like to use the recipe analogy, and I've never come across a situation where that doesn't resonate with everybody. The other thing that we can do is consider some specific and tailored tools and resources to address the practical aspects of daily life, sort of break things down. And one of the things that we know is that there's many examples of customizable care notebooks and with templates even, and to facilitate accurate record keeping. So people might just keep a folder, but it's also important to track signs and symptoms, because that can really help guide the genetic testing process as well as management. So one of the things we can do is to really help facilitate and foster a sense of control, because we know that there is so much uncertainty through the process of genetic testing and actually reaching a diagnosis. And when I say be actively encouraging, I mean, I guess we should think that's a no-brainer, but I think a lot of families say that they need that the healthcare providers to acknowledge and emphasize the authority and competence of care for themselves or their child, and the clear value of the advocacy that advocacy role that they play within the healthcare system and the community and the school in all aspects of life. And what we can also do is mutually assess the controllability of specific stresses. What are the things that we can perhaps tackle together? What can we help with? And one of the classic examples that we'll all be familiar with is access to therapies and funding. And what role can we play in helping families to access those things that are so essential to the care of their child? And we can also guide families to high quality resources to help facilitate connections with others. And you may have already seen these particular examples on the right hand side, and the links will be provided in the resource list. I think it just stating families can go out there, but there's so many resources, and I think, you know, people can get lost. So to give them some examples of high quality resources can give them a place to start. So this slide really is just to try and draw it all together about the process of what we can do to promote mutual support between health providers for families with or without diagnosis. And really, I guess we start, of course, with the building partnerships, and that we look at this as an open-ended process, and we present to families that there's a possibility rather than a likelihood of definitive answers, including a diagnosis, let alone management and treatment options. It doesn't mean we don't try, but that it's possible, and we have no real way of predicting how certain it is that there will be a diagnosis. And at balancing expectations. So we talk about it, but also to explicitly consider the uncertainty. Even if we do find a diagnosis, what does that tell us about the prognosis and treatment options? Because of course, many of you will know that there is very little information available for rare and ultra rare conditions, even when that diagnosis is made. And so structured support and understanding. So follow up, when will we follow up with you? Understanding that there's confusion, there's actually, has our situation changed if a diagnosis is made? And adjustment, what are the implications of that condition? And of course, with the decision making. And I am going to put that plug there, consider for referral for genetic counselling. Vested interest on my behalf, but it is very much within our role to foster and provide that support and understanding. And normalising experience of uncertainty. So not just considering uncertainty as a major issue, but to talk about the fact that there is variability even with common disorders, and people are much more aware of that now. I always use the example of Down syndrome. We know that there are people who are much more severely affected than others. And the continuity of care is something that it really forms the scaffold and framework for our partnerships with families. We need to emphasise and reassure that care will continue regardless of uncertainty. With or without a diagnosis, we'll continue to care for you and your child. And that then leads directly to that collective commitment that we will follow up. When's that going to be? What will happen? And when are we going to meet with you? How available will we be to answer any questions? And hopefully, ultimately, a combination of these factors will mean that we'll be able to maintain partnerships with families. So I'll leave it there, and I'll look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Steph, that was really fantastic. So now I'd like to hand over to Anapak Choi, and Anna will be sharing her family's story and the experience they had in genetic testing and palliative care for her son Sebi, as well as insights from her work with the Rare Find Foundation. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And also thank you to Palliative Care Australia for the opportunity to present here as alongside a great panel as well. So again, my name's Anapak Choi, and I'm the founder and chairperson of the Rare Find Foundation. The Rare Find Foundation exists to support children with Tay-Sachs and Sandhoff diseases throughout Australia. But also we called ourselves Rare Find Foundation as a more broader term so that we can help support families and those affected by rare diseases that don't have a patient organisation or a home to go to. Of these beautiful faces on the screen in front of us, sadly, 3 have died and 4 are living with an incurable disease. One of those beautiful children faces and the cherubs that have passed away is my son Sebi, as we mentioned, and he was 22 months when he passed away. So the Rare Find Foundation launched in 2019. It's the first of its kind in Australia, and we do operate nationally. One of the first initiatives that we launched was and actually mindful of language and inclusivity and allowing families to be able to absorb information at their own pace and share with elderly family members or teenagers, is some guides and booklets that come in both hard copy and downloadable versions too. So the hard copy versions are actually separated into 6 different booklets, and that's designed so that actually people can pick and choose which of the booklets they want to be able to read at a specific amount of time or distribute them accordingly. And they can do so in the privacy that they need to, and importantly, often away from the internet, which we know can be a real rabbit hole actually for people to go down. And then once you're down there, you have no control over the information that you're able to obtain and at what pace. So one of the topics that I'm talking about today is palliative care, and if it's appropriate, how and when shall it be introduced? The first thing I want to say is that I think it's important to try and start to remove the negative connotations around palliative care being just end of life care or caring for people dying, because well-delivered palliative care is actually really quality of life care. There isn't a one size fits all, of course, as well. And I think something that is important to talk about when introducing the palliative care process to a family going through this situation is that there's a lot of different phases and stages. And this is broad, but to sort of categorize it a little bit more, there's the pre-diagnosis. So that's when a family's in the naive bliss, and then they know something's not right. They're going to a lot of tests. And then eventually they get a diagnosis. Sometimes it's multiple diagnoses before they get the one that is accurate. The PTSD sometimes associated around receiving that diagnosis is something that is a huge milestone emotionally. It can be extremely traumatic, and it's the day that their lives change forever. So I think there's a focus that really can go on, and I actually, myself and the other panel members were mentioning what an important subject it is, in terms of how much support can be given to family members or those affected at the time of receiving a diagnosis, and equipping them with the ways to be able to support the trauma around the diagnosis or those elements can really help them face the challenges that are coming up. They're 2 significant critical milestones, is receiving a diagnosis and your child dying. And there's a lot of support that can be provided between them. The next one is a solution mode. And as we can all imagine, receiving a diagnosis that your child has a life-limiting condition is really, really hard to take in the first instance. So our natural instincts as parents or caregivers is to try and find a solution. And trying to find a solution often looks like sourcing treatment, speaking with other specialists, speaking with other families who have the same condition if they can, and trying to fix it. So ultimately, not every family will experience this, and often options are exhausted within a few weeks. So then the next stage or step or timeline process is the precious time. And that's really, a lot of complex care, their life's changed, and that's full of anticipatory grief often as well, which is something that palliative care can help support. So, there's, in short, there is no right time, but often the earlier on is the better, because then families can get support with all of these things. And if we think about it like quality of care, quality of life care, then it's a lot more embracing. It also means that people are able to draw, create continuity in relationships and trust along the process. One thing I will make a point of is that often it's really important to be mindful of the solution mode and the sensitivity that we use when talking about palliative care with individuals who are trying to fix it or find a solution, because their aptitude to be able to embrace palliative care at that stage might not be what it would be a little bit later, a little bit earlier. It doesn't mean that it can't be introduced. It just means that it needs to be treated sensitively. I also think it's really important to note, and I've had a lot of families mention to me that they've had to seek out palliative care, or palliative care services haven't been automatically offered to them. So that's something that we need to look at as well, because it should really be an offer that's presented to the family. And just remembering, of course, as well, that, you know, palliative care, it's not always one size fits all. And actually, you know, although it depends on someone's religious or cultural or family dynamic circumstances, there are always the layers within the family as well, right? So it's, you know, you can be accommodating one family member, but actually the direct versus indirect comfort that another family member may receive by seeing their partner or child comforted also has a great impact. So there's lots of layers to that. And I think as well, when we talk about palliative care and why and what and how, the language is a really important one. When we're talking about language, it's so important to encourage continuity of language and messaging. And that's cohesive language, both within the direct contact that you're having with that one family and also the healthcare specialists that are dealing with them broadly. So it increases trust, it creates really a comforting experience, and it also reduces cynicism when there's good continuity of language and messaging. Typically, we find, particularly in the earlier stages of diagnosis, families are in two states, and I'm sure many of you may have seen this yourself. There's the blur and the fog, which is not retaining much information. Their minds are spinning, they're catching occasional words, but their thoughts are really spiraling, and you can often see this on a family member's face. And then there's laser focus. So what you're telling them about what's happening inside of their child's body, or how you're going to care for them, or how they can care for them, is the most important information they've ever heard. They've got a razor sharp memory and they're retaining everything. They're going to play it back in their mind in the middle of the night, and they're going to be comparing notes with their partner, or comparing notes that what one person said versus another specialist. And I think, you know, that's another reason why there's an important emphasis on the language at all times, no matter what state the family is in, or no matter what information you're giving. Language really has an important draw card. And I think sometimes an important emphasis to put on that is ensuring that we're pinning down and drawing back to the why. So if a child's dosage of medication is changed, it's really important to explain the reasoning why. Not just the fact that the medicine's changing or the dose is changing, but actually a family might assume it's because the condition's worsening, but it might be because the child's been putting on weight and so it's breaking through. And those two things have a very significant difference in effect of emotionally how the family will treat that information, as an example. So when we talk about language, again, it's so subjective and it's dependent on so many different scenarios. The considerations, some of the considerations I think is, you know, can really increase reassurance or trust. There are definitely language words to avoid and words to comfort. And there's also the right thing to say and the wrong way of saying it. An example of this is that there has been an occasion where I was talking to someone who was in the field about the days leading up to my son's death, and they actually were saying all the right things, and we were doing this virtually, but they were eating cake while they were doing it, and having their morning tea. And, you know, although they were saying the right things, it was pretty inappropriate in terms of how it made me feel in that circumstance. So sometimes there is the right way to say things and the wrong way of saying it, or the right time to say it as well. And then there's the normalization of traumatic words. So to begin with, considering your child having a seizure or not being able to eat can be pretty traumatic considerations. But then obviously how you normalize words so that we can incorporate them into the treatment and the care for children as they're going along. I just want to finish up by saying, I guess, that, language is such an important point in all of these circumstances. Really, families in these situations don't have control over the diagnosis. They don't have a control over the treatment or what's available to help make their child be better. And they don't have control over the prognosis or the outcome. So information is the thing that gives them the control in this situation, and language gives them the information. So that's, I think, why it's really important emphasis. And I'm pleased that Palliative Care Australia nominated this as a good subject to cover. And I think each of us are covering it in different elements because it ties back to so much importance in how it carries through. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anna. And I'm going to start with an apology. For those of you who know me, I have several obsessions and several, key limitations. One of my obsessions is food. One of my key limitations is names. I'm terrible at pronouncing them. I'm terrible at remembering them. And I think for Anna, I managed to combine both of those things and introduce a food as a name. So my sincere apologies, Anna. But now I would like to hand over to Heather, who will be sharing her own lived experience, as well as insights from families she supports through SWAN. So over to you.
Thanks, Gareth, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. It's an absolute privilege to speak alongside people like Anna, Steph, and Gareth. So I'm going to talk about the diagnostic journey. What and where is the support? Because we know sometimes SWAN families do fall through the gaps. So many of you would have heard of the poem Welcome to Holland, and the family's on a plane, they think they're going to Italy, and they land in Holland. But for SWAN families, the plane hasn't landed yet, and it's like being in limbo land. We waited 9 years for our daughter's diagnosis. We did have a couple of misdiagnoses in that time, another stressful time to have a diagnosis, think the worst, and then have that diagnosis withdrawn and back to the drawing board. So limbo land, the plane hasn't landed. We don't know where we are. And it's a land full of anxiety, uncertainty, isolation, and it can be frustrating. Parents have to repeat their story continuously to different medical doctors, hoping that they can put all the pieces of the puzzle together and give them a diagnosis. Parents feel vulnerable, and I've been in quite a few situations, such as pushing my 16-year-old daughter on a swing, and a 2-year-old would come up and jump on the swing and push themselves. And next thing you know, you're in tears because you realise your child at 16 still can't push themselves on a swing. Or your son's playing trumpet in a concert and you've got tears streaming down your face because the reality is, your daughter will never have those opportunities. Parents feel guilty, particularly if they think they're the ones who've passed on their condition to the child. Parents have so much guilt anyway. I think that when you have a child with a complex condition, you have even more guilt. And the grief, you might have heard the term ambiguous grief or living grief. You're grieving for the typical child you don't have. The dream of them maybe getting married, going to university, having the kids of their own is often gone. We know so many carers end up on antidepressants. It's really stressful. You can feel helpless. Shouldn't I be doing more to help my child? And there's that denial. And I remember when my daughter was 1, we went to early childhood intervention service, and I looked around and I thought, everyone else needs to be here. We're just going to get our low muscle tone fixed up and our poor eyesight, and we'll be out of here. And I even asked the manager, do many of your children go on to university? And she must have just thought this poor woman had a long way to go. And I did have a long way to go. It takes time. It's a journey. It's a process. And we know many relationships break down. It is really stressful. We have concerns, we have questions. Is it a regressing condition and is the clock ticking? Or what if I want more children? Will I get an answer before I get too old to have more children? People ask, why don't I have a diagnosis? Come on, we've got sequencing now. It's 2023. We know there are so many genes yet to discover the function of. And we can overanalyze things and question things. So is my daughter a poor sleeper? Is that related to her condition, or is she just a poor sleeper? I think, as parents of complex children, we never stop thinking, we never truly relax, and our brain goes all the time. And the impact on other family members, such as siblings, grandparents, it impacts every family member. And people ask, well, if I had a diagnosis, would that give me a treatment? Is that a cure? And we know supports are often system-based, not needs-based, particularly when it comes to government supports. We have a number of SWAN families who get rejected from carers allowance, carer payment, and the NDIS, and it shouldn't be that way. So who can support families? I think peer support groups can play a vital role, talking to other people who are having a similar experience to yourself. The healthcare team, including allied health professionals, families, friends, government supports, the NDIS, we need a multidisciplinary approach. Educators, talking to health teams, talking to parents. It's everyone working together to support the family the best way they can. So supporting families, being able to connect, and I think when you do have a diagnosis and you can connect with other people with that same diagnosis, you can learn from them, and it's really reassuring, particularly if you're talking to families who've got children older than yours. You can see how the disease might progress. And again, the common theme of communication. It's got to be respectful and it's got to be appropriate and use appropriate language. If you've got a family and the parents have intellectual disability or are from a cold background, they may not be able to understand a plain English brochure. And SWAN's developed some easy English brochures to try and help those in those situations. And follow up. Parents want to know they're not forgotten. And we hear this time and time again. Parents feel like they're forgotten when they're waiting for test results. And often it's about managing expectations. If a parent's told a result is going to be back in 6 months and it's not back for 9 months, that's an additional 3 months of anxiety that that parent might experience. And I think we've got to remember parents are their child's best experts, and we need to respect that. Whereas clinicians are the textbooks best experts. They know the textbooks, we know our kids because we live with them every day. And it's about collaboration, partnerships in healthcare, and with that comes trust and transparency. Everyone needs to work together to support families. So what's the impact of a diagnosis or no diagnosis? What can you expect? When you have a diagnosis, it does unlock doors and you can get a glimpse of what the future might hold for your child. But without a diagnosis, it's very hard to know what to expect. When you have a diagnosis, it may be easier to cope than when you don't have one and you don't know what path your child will take. And then when you do get a diagnosis, it can be incredibly overwhelming and it can take time to process. But also, I know as a parent myself, I put everything in thinking we would get a diagnosis. So if we were to be told, no, we don't have an answer now, I would have just felt shattered, even though I knew in reality there's such a small percentage that actually do get a diagnosis. And with a diagnosis, it can lead to further worry, particularly if it is a life-limiting condition and you weren't expecting that to be told to you when you're in that room where you receive the news of the diagnosis. It can lead to concerns, more anxiety, more questions. But without a diagnosis, it's hard to find treatments and therapy, and we want a targeted approach. So without a diagnosis, you are limited. And when you do have a diagnosis, and you can go for targeted supports. such as a child's hospice, which you may not have qualified for if your child didn't have a life-limiting condition. So for me, it was really important to get a diagnosis, for probably more for my son to know whether he was a carrier. So I think for medical implications, to know what to expect, we could then target more effective treatments, targeted therapy. I've become a so-called expert in FOXP1. I have a Google alert on my phone. Whenever there's a paper published, I get an alert, I read it. If it's relevant, I pass it on to my daughter's geneticist to educate him in the hope that we can diagnose more families with FOXP1. And we'll see increased collaboration, education, contributing to research papers to try and learn more about the condition, which I think is really important for families who are coming after us. I always say never underestimate the value of peer support and connection, and I've learnt so much from talking to parents who've got older kids with FOXP1. And when you do have that diagnosis, access to supports is easier because you can tick that box on that bureaucratic form. Many SWAN families report being less depressed and even being able to go off antidepressants when they get that diagnosis. And I always say knowledge is empowerment, and empowerment leads to informed decision making. And I will pass you back to Gareth now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. You're extraordinarily valuable insights. And to those submitting the questions in the chat, and those who haven't already, keep them coming. It's great to see them arriving in the chat box. So now we're going to hand over to these three experts and in a panel, and so we're going to ask them some questions. And as usual, I'm going to go off script a little bit. So if 6 in 10 deaths in children are due to rare diseases, how can we best get palliative? How can we best get diagnostic testing for rare diseases introduced into palliative care pathways? Or does that already exist? Do palliative care pathways in Australia already have genetic testing built in as part of their process? So how would we do this best? And perhaps picking up on Anna's theme, it's not just about a pathway, it's about the language, the shared lexicon. So we're all on the same page and we reassure each other. So I'm going to ask this first in reverse order to the discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Heather.
Look, I think we've come a long way with genetic testing. We have a Medicare item number if your child's under the age of 10 that fits certain criteria, but the ones over age 10 can fall through the gaps. So I think we need to be having meetings with politicians, lobbying for this, because it's not fair. It shouldn't be based on age. We need access and timely access for everyone who requires genetic testing in the hope that we can give them an answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heather. Anna?
So I think that it's a really multi-pronged approach, and there's obviously postnatal testing, and just to give a little bit of an insight as to how we received our diagnosis, we actually had done a 23andMe ancestry test for genealogy intrigue, and subsequently we were able to get a health report which showed that both my husband and I were carriers for a thing called Tay-Sachs that we didn't know existed. So I do tend to feel like a lot of the information that we could have in the year 2023 that's available scientifically, alongside the knowledge that we have, can actually help prevent. So it's not just the 6 in 10 deaths occurring in children from rare diseases. How many can we prevent as well? So it's a bit of a heavy-handed question for a response for a big question, really.
That's great. So, we need to think about this holistically. We need to think about diagnosis, prevention, and how we best support people through their journeys whilst they either have a diagnosis or whilst they're still awaiting them, including, very importantly, in their palliative care journeys. If I was to reflect that. Steph?
So if I think about it from a healthcare system perspective, I think that there should be greater collaboration and open dialogue between different services. And I think that those pathways, those bridges of connection between services can be improved on a lot of the time. And I think it can be, in terms of actually individualising the way that a family is brought into the process of genetic testing, it can start as simply as doing a very detailed referral to the genetic services, letting us know a bit about the background for a family, a bit about what their particular worries or concerns are. That's at the very basic level. Having dialogue by email, or even better by phone, let alone very exciting in person, about what this individual family, what their situation is, and how can we best work together as healthcare teams to tailor the language, tailor the process itself, and reassure the family that the services are in contact with each other as well as with the family, because I think a lot of the time, people feel as if the teams never talk to each other, and that's true. It is true a lot of the time. So I think that open dialogue between genetic services as they get involved in and whether we can support other specialty teams, such as the palliative care team, to initiate the discussions, and whether we can help support the way that the language they use and how that process starts, let alone how that process goes along the way.
Thanks, Steph. Some really practical, pragmatic solutions there. And if I put my policy hat on and I was to ask a question, or maybe ask a question to everybody, should the reconsideration of diagnosis be made at key transition points for children, we'll use the pediatric lens, for children with complex conditions, because many of them will have an underlying rare genetic disease cause, and they may not have had access to diagnostic testing, or that testing may have been done many years ago when technology was different. But should it just be standard that if you've got a complex multi-system disorder, for instance, and you're transitioning to school age, or you're transitioning between pediatric and adult care, or you're transitioning to palliative care, should that just be a standard key decision, red flag that diagnosis needs to be reconsidered? So I'm not asking for an answer to that. I'm just speculating that because we've got limited time. I was talking to some GPs yesterday, and they said, we don't know how to even raise the possibility of a rare disease and start that discussion with families. That frightens us. We're not sure what to do. So as a bit of a corollary to that, how do you discuss genetic testing with loved ones? So I'm going to start this time with Steph and go back the other way.
Sorry, Gareth, how do you discuss genetic testing
with loved ones?
With loved ones. So if it's been broached with you as the immediate family, how do you then discuss it with the rest of your family? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think unfortunately a lot of responsibility falls on the shoulders of the parents to do the learning themselves and then educating others in the family. And so I think as healthcare professionals, we can start by talking with families about, okay, taking that next step, what resources are there and how can you broach this with your family? And I guess people, using that simple language to explain that, if there's a possibility that we could be carriers of this condition, then this is something that could be passed. It could be something that affects different members of the family in different ways. And I think that starting from that very the basic perspective of just explaining what the purpose of the genetic testing is, what is it for, and then talking about what you're hoping as a family to get from that genetic testing, and I guess people getting other family members involved right at the beginning, not at the end when you have a result that then you go and say, well, guess what? I think that was something that we would encourage, but there are some really good resources about communicating with family about genetic testing. And I think it really is part of the duty of care that we have as healthcare providers to assist that. And whether that's writing letters that families can give to their relatives, sometimes we can help with that as well. So I think it's actually putting it on the table and saying, you know, what might be some of the questions that your family can, the rest of your family might come up with.
That's great,
And
Steph. I'm just going to.
Do you understand the process yourself?
To hand over to that. That's great. And we're going to come back to resources. So thanks for raising that. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I also want to hear what Heather and Anna have to say. So I think I was going in reverse order. So I was going back to now Anna before Heather, I think. Anna.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. And, you know, you have to navigate a lot of people's feelings and the complexities of the situation. Some people, some family members, in my own lived experience, didn't take it as seriously, and that added a lot of pressure on us, particularly when you're trying to map out different sides of the family when it comes to autosomal recessive conditions and carrier statuses. So, you know, it is a big implication. There's a lot of implications. It's a big part of the process, and it's really important to make sure that we're considering both the feelings and the repercussions, and really well articulating what the implications are for the families. Again, considering if people are pregnant, and, you know, I think a lot of visuals or diagrams actually help, so that it's not just people don't think that you're trying to share your situation with them, but they actually understand the mechanics around why that works, and why it could affect them, particularly if it's hereditary, and particularly obviously if it's autosomal recessive, for example. So there's, you know, again, diagrams, good language, and also I think when it's done well and people are you know, they have a good level of empathy or sympathy with it, you know, they'll also be able to help support during that process after they've received hopefully a positive, good result from themselves being tested, because it does introduce the idea that it's so close to home and it could happen to them as well. So they might actually, it might increase the level of support that they're able to give emotionally and logistically throughout the journey for a family.
Thanks very much, Anna. Awesome. And Heather?
Look, I think it's hard because sometimes parents haven't got their head around the diagnosis themselves. They're not ready to share. And we've got many SWAN families who they may not tell other family members their child has a genetic condition for several months. So I really like Steph's helpful tip: work with a genetic counsellor to help draft a letter, because sometimes it's easier to give something in writing that describes the condition, their concerns. It's less confronting than talking face to face when they're not ready and they're not emotionally in the right headspace to do so.
Thanks, Heather. And so that brings us back to resources. I know Steph has been very proactive and put together a resource list. So thank you very much, Steph, for doing that. We're going to start with you and go back to Steph. Go for it, Heather.
Resources, look, I think they're really valuable. And I noticed there was a question in the chat about peer support groups. And I think it's about letting families know where the information is available. They might not be ready to join a peer support group at that point in time. And we do have families who go, I know about SWAN, but I wasn't ready for 2 years. And other families who sit on our Facebook group for a number of years before they even say boo, because it's a journey, it's individual. But I think if you can provide the links and perhaps at a follow-up appointment, just check in with the family and say, look, just letting you know the resource list is there when you're ready. But if you don't offer, how are people going to find out? Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Anna?
Yeah, I agree with that. And just touching on that question as well, prompting Heather there about the peer support. And, you know, it is deeply personal, and particularly with rare diseases, there may not be many people within your state or within your country, and indeed nationally, so internationally. So it's really important sometimes for families to build that level of connection. And it's a great question around the timing though too, because inevitably you are going to see families whose situations are perhaps a little bit further down the track, and it's an insight into a future that you may not have realised is going to exist for you. But that said, I've also, both myself and other families that are within like our charity that we work with and much further abroad, find a deep level of comfort in knowing that you're not the only one. Because when you get a rare disease diagnosis, you feel like you're the only one. And, there is a great level of unfairness. And although you don't want there to be anyone else going through it, the fact that there is. And often as well, worth noting, and this is a sad fact, but sometimes there's a lot of people in your inner or outer network that don't know how to deal with what you're going through. So you get a lot of distance from people that you would never expect to be the case. But then also you find this and forge these connections with this unlikely group of, incredible humans and parents and family members and support workers who actually shed some light shining onto this horrible situation and scenario. And sometimes you almost need that counterbalance, as confronting as it is. So it's a really deeply personal choice as to when it makes, when is right, as are all of these options, or, but again, the information is key. So knowing they are there enables families to have the control to be able to enter in. And the other thing that I'll say is that often the family dynamic is not the same. One parent wants to go further than the other at a different point of time. It might be a single parent household and they need that connection more so to sort of substitute the relationship that they need to bounce off. There are so many scenarios in which this is really important, and it's an individual it's an individual decision, really.
Awesome, thanks, Anna. And Steph, last but not least by any means.
Yeah, there's just great points made both by Heather and Anna, and I think that one thing I would add is that just in terms of working with families is just to raise their awareness of some of the resources that are out there, whether it's a support group or a website about a particular condition, is that sometimes they're single author and they present a quite a biased view of the situation, and with all the best of intentions, they might have is at the very severe end of the spectrum, or they might be affected themselves. And it's just setting the scene that there can be a lot of resources where people are telling worst case scenarios, or at their stage of the journey are coping with perhaps a more catastrophized version of their life events. Or I think just giving people that balanced view that it's vital to make connections and look at resources, but that they can be biased by the person who has created that website or that group. And also just to help guide families to appropriate resources rather than expect them to trawl the net, as you said before, Anna. It's just, it's a bottomless pit, and people don't have the time. So I think we can guide people to high quality, just a small handful of resources to start with, so that they're just not feeling like it's a completely impossible task.
Thanks very much, Steph. And we've got some really fantastic questions coming through in the chat. And so I'm going to pick some of those out. There's some really sort of common themes amongst the questions in terms of how do we better enable people, how do we get better access to training and training to the right people, and at the right time. So, for instance, we have one question here: how do we advocate for training of health professionals in everything you've all mentioned? Sorry, I've just lost the question there. And everything you've all mentioned today, how do we ensure it's embedded into the learning curriculum for health professionals?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
A really important one. Yeah.
Any comments from the panel?
Look, I always take the opportunity to talk to students whenever I can. So I've spoken to doctors who are trained to be geneticists, medical students, psychologists, allied health professionals. I think, and Anna, it's probably the same, any opportunity that you can take to spread awareness, I think our duty as advocates is to take those and try and educate, so new families coming through don't experience some of what we've had to deal with. Because, yeah, I know when we got our first misdiagnosis, we were shown 2 slides and told, your daughter doesn't have this condition we were led to believe was a life-limiting condition for 2.5 years. So if we can prevent that happening to the next person and call it out, then that's what we should do. And, it is a journey, and certainly when my daughter was a lot younger, I wasn't the advocate I was today, and I kind of regret that in some ways, but I'm trying to make up for lost time now.
Oh gosh, you're amazing. and you know, if you haven't been told that lately, you should have been, or I am. So there's a bit about opportunistic, wherever we can, however we can. I guess there might also be a bit about how do we actually get rare diseases into curriculum and for doctors, nurses, allied health, educators, because they're completely absent as a
systemic solution that needs to happen.
As a systemic solution. Exactly. So if we now know that rare diseases are the biggest killer of kids, we now know that rare diseases account for the biggest hospital expenditures, both for adults and kids. Why aren't rare diseases in our curriculum for our health professionals and other professionals? This is a question I'm asking. Steph, do you have any comments on training?
I kind of think you've got your finger in more pies than the rest of us have as far as that goes at a higher level for training. But, you know, we know there's a number of different groups, so Medics for Rare, and different groups who are looking at that wide system-wide education. But like Heather, I would just say that for my own professional role, yes, with medical students, registrar training and professional development sessions, and I'm always making the most of those opportunities. And one of the things that I think is really important is that you get the background about rare diseases. But you know, I think as a genetic counselor, when we talk about language, I think we need to drill right down to what does that actually look like. What words are we talking about? Like, we take it right down to the level of the bedside or the table in the office. You know, what words do we think you know, not just to use appropriate language, because people don't know what that is. So I think that the education, it's embedding it into the learning curricula is one thing, but it's also, for me, one of the most important things is to bring it down to you're in an interaction, whether that's through role plays or, you know, actually talking about scripting. What language can I use? What analogies can I use to explain things? And I think that's where we can all contribute, because we know when we've heard things that just, yeah, as you said, Anna, that just have been the wrong thing to say or the right thing in the wrong way, and actually giving those examples to upcoming health professionals so that it actually sinks in. It's actually at the practical level.
That's great. So we've got opportunistic, we've got a systems-based approach, and then we're getting extremely pragmatic and practical. So how do we use the right language, the kind language, in the right time in the right way? So I'm going to some themes around some other questions that are coming through, and I'm going to direct this to Anna. So there's a question here. Do you feel patients feel an extra burden in having to explain the diagnosis to friends and family? How do we talk them through having to reiterate a life-changing diagnosis to those who are close to the family? So this concept of almost the recurrent trauma of ripping off not just a Band-Aid, I guess it's ripping off a bandage over an infected wound that someone's rubbed salt into over and over again. So how do we address that?
Sure. So actually, there's a few different tactics that we're taking that we're aware of. So first of all, one of the reasons that we've published the guides in hard copy to begin with as well is so that there's a separate section which is just about the condition. And that means that if a family member doesn't feel like they need to go into they can go into a great level of detail and retell and say all the questions, they can hand this brochure over to someone that they need to know. And it's not just close family members, it's also neighbours, the school, healthcare professionals. It's incredible how many allied support service providers would come to a home and say, I've never heard of that condition before, when it's so easy, like it should be standard practice for them to Google what the condition is before they come in the door, instead of the parent having to describe it for the 20 millionth time. The other thing is that we've looked at running, which is something that we're going to start doing, and this is, you know, not just relevant for Tay-Sachs and Sandhoff, but having a tutorial, if you like, on and working with it's almost like a branding or PR piece that you can say out loud and detach your mind from. So it's words that are coming out of your mouth related to the situation, and giving a short, succinct explanation that you can emotionally disconnect from, so that when you see Susan in the supermarket and she asked how the kids are going, you can actually relay it without it being a traumatic event over and over again. So it's really, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I think about this a lot on behalf of, you know, the other families, and not just the families suffering from Tay-Sachs and Sandhoff diseases, but the other rare disease families that we deal with. And it's such a big thing to have to go through the hurdles each and every time. So, you know, I think having the information that can be handed to and not feeling like you have to give a verbal explanation that's really detailed is an important thing. And then also having a short, sharp, succinct narrative that you can say, but, you know, almost train yourself to emotionally disconnect. Easier said than done, but, you know, emotionally disconnect yourself from. And then also the other thing is, it's okay just to say, like, not give explanations. So it's also okay to go to the hairdressers, and you're not doing a disservice to your child or the condition, to go to the hairdressers, get your hair cut, and when they say, how are things? You go, good, nod, smile, pick up a newspaper, read it without giving an explanation that's deep diving into your personal situation. Sometimes I think families feel like they have to do their child the service, or their family the service of actually explaining what the situation is. And you're allowed to have your own time at doing that as well. So, you know, there's a bit of a tangent, but I think really important when we're talking about how we're outwardly discussing a condition and the obligation on parents and family members to explain it.
So not a tangent at all. I think it's really directly related. So again, if I reflect that, you know, it's the providing the resources, the tools, the way for families to be able to share their one story, and that they can use over and over again in the way that provides the information but minimises the trauma, and also very expressly giving oneself permission not to share that story, and to just be people and just be parents. So I think, you know, they're very powerful points. Now, aware that everyone's time is extraordinarily valuable, especially the people who have dialed into this call, and so we're running towards the end of time. So I'm going to summarize here, and just take a moment to reflect on, again, you know, the privilege that we have in having these experts come along and share their opinions from the different and very complementary perspectives, and the wonderful comments and questions that have been shared online from all of you today, as we together try to create a shared language, a shared lexicon that helps people better on their rare disease journey, and particularly in their palliative care journey. In the last session, we talked about to think rare, think care, think together. Well, today we're talking about think rare, think palliative care, think together. And so next, there will be a resource list, and thanks again to Stephanie for putting together the resource list that will be shared. Following this session. The next webinar will be at the end of March. It'll be on difficult conversations in perinatal palliative care, a really critical topic. So make sure you're following Palliative Care Australia on socials to be in the loop for when registrations are open. And again, it's really important that we care for ourselves and each other. So please be kind to yourself. If there are emotional components that have been raised through this session, that's not to be unexpected. And please, look after yourselves by reaching out to whoever you need to. And with that, I want again just to thank all the attendees, to thank Palliative Care Australia for putting on this amazing session and series of sessions, and most of all to Stephanie, to Heather, and to Anne for sharing their extremely valuable expertise. And we wish you all a wonderful day. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.